As we've seen in other chapters within this series, we've learned pretty quickly, and in fact we know this intuitively, that volume is exciting. Whenever something that we want to be a part of is happening, we turn its volume up. Our favourite songs when we're out listening to music, we turn them up. When people come to our studios to listen to tracks we're working on, we turn them up. We like being surrounded by volume, whether it's at gigs or in clubs or anywhere. Volume equals quality. Now, it shouldn't be like that because it's a much more nuanced topic than that. We've seen that all the way through the course. But there's no denying the fact that we do tend to measure volume as a sort of quality stamp for the piece of music that we're working on. And as a result of that, it's often the case that people ask the question, how do I make my music as loud as everybody else's? And these days, a really important secondary question, which is how loud is loud enough for streaming services, whether that's Spotify or Apple Music or SoundCloud or Beatport or anywhere else you might want to be looking to try and put your music out. Now, there's no easy one-shot answer to this particular question because different platforms require different things. However, there is one really good piece of news, which is that to some extent, you don't need to worry. If you want to get your music onto Spotify and you're self-releasing, you can make a master at the normal volume that you would, and Spotify's algorithms will transcode your music so that it's ready to be on their platform. There isn't a sort of barrier to entry if the music that you've made is too loud for the Spotify sort of platform. However, it is a little bit more nuanced than that, because these days, the way that we measure loudness in terms of making sure that our music fits onto these systems, or the way in which those systems analyze music, is via a sort of new loudness system, which we refer to as LUFS, loudness units full scale. And different platforms require or use different LUFS settings as their sort of default volume. Now, to really understand what LUFS are, we need to really understand how we hear volume. And actually, there are kind of three ways in which volume can be measured. So we have true peak monitoring, which basically means we're looking for, within a waveform, or listening to the loudest transient moments, those bits in your waveform where the peaks are at their highest. Now, the interesting thing about peaks is that actually most of the time, that isn't how we hear sound at all. If I was to take two sounds, let's say a door slamming and the sound of a pneumatic drill recorded on the street, and I was to put those two sounds and make them be exactly the same volume, which one would sound louder? Well, the answer is the drill, because it's louder for longer. The average volume of that sound lasts for longer, and therefore we associate it as being louder. Even though, in peak terms, the loudest part of the door slam is the same volume as the consistent volume of that drill. So effectively what we've got is an understanding that peak volume isn't the thing that we respond to the most. We respond to average volume instead. Okay, so we've got true peak monitoring, and then we've got average volume sort of monitoring. Now, the way that we used to monitor a sort of average volume was via a system called root mean square, or RMS for short. And RMS volume effectively looks at average volume across the entire frequency spectrum, from the lowest bass signal all the way through to the highest treble signal. And that's fine, except that that isn't how we hear either. It turns out that our hearing systems are kind of optimized for mid-range frequencies. We're better at picking those out than we are super low bass and super high treble. So it's the kind of middle of a mix that we respond to. And this is where LUFS come in, because LUFS is effectively a loudness measure of average volume centered around the frequencies that human beings respond to the most. Before we get bogged down in any more technical detail, let's have a look at all of that. So what I can do when I want to meter or monitor the way that volume is being looked at within a mix is that I have a number of different options. I'm going to bring in two here. I'm going to bring in a level meter, and I'm also going to bring in a loudness meter. Now, my level meter is going to allow me to look at peak and RMS settings, whilst my loudness meter is going to be looking at LUFS settings. So we've got these two meters side by side, and what I'm going to do is play this track, and we're just going to have a listen to it and look at how those different meters respond to the data within my mix. Okay, let's look at peak and RMS first. Now, I said that there is a way that we sort of listen to music and we don't really respond to peaks. We tend to respond to average level. And to put that in some sort of perspective, the peak level of this track across the left and right sides of my mix rises to around minus 3.3 dB, whereas the RMS level is a lot quieter than that. So effectively, those little momentary spikes are so much louder. In fact, in this case, let's call it 13 dB louder. And yet when I press play on this mix, we aren't constantly hearing a 13 decibel rise and fall, because that's not how our ears are sort of attenuated, if you like, to the way that we actually listen to music. So peak and RMS are effectively monitoring individual peaks and also the kind of average root mean square averaging out of my mix overall. And then over on the right hand side, we've got LUFS. Now, interestingly, LUFS is split into 3 different sort of time zones. We have momentary LUFS, which basically means a sort of minute by minute reading of that signal. And you'll find that the momentary sort of reading is actually quite similar to the RMS. But remember that this is calibrated far more for the frequencies around which our ears are attuned and sort of calibrated for listening to music. And then we've got the other 2 ways in which we can monitor the way that LUFS can be measured as well. So we've got a short-term measure, which is longer than momentary. That's effectively looking at a sort of slightly longer-term view, maybe a second or 2. And then we've got integrated LUFS. Now, this is in a sense the most important of all of the LUFS measurements, because it's the one that most of those streaming services are interested in. So for instance, on Spotify, to take one example, at the time of making this course, this could change at any time, but Spotify's current measure is what's referred to as minus 14 integrated LUFS, minus 14 dB. So in other words, what they're looking for is an integrated LUFS level which over the duration of your entire piece of music doesn't exceed minus 14. Well, let's find out how loud my track is right now by pressing the start button, and then we'll look at the LUFS setting again. So across all of those meters, we have a chance. You can see the short-term one taking a little longer to fade away than the momentary one, because of course it's designed to measure or take a sort of snapshot of volume over a longer period of time. And then we're left with our integrated setting, which is telling us how loud this mix is. Now then, the reason why this matters so much is because when it comes to streaming platforms, and because it's the integrated value that most of those platforms are looking at, we have a really interesting opportunity to decide whether or not we want to kind of slightly play with the opportunity for our track on those streaming platforms to feel a little bit louder than other pieces of music. What do I mean by that? Okay, well, it sort of stands to reason that if you've got an integrated LUFS setting, which is an average of the entire duration of your piece, if some of your music spends quite a long time quieter than that integrated maximum level that one of those streaming platforms is looking for, it means that when you want the bigger section of your track to arrive and really hit home, it can afford to be a little bit louder, because averaged against the quieter moments, there can be more dynamic range. In other words, that loud bit can feel a little bit louder. Now, if you've tended to notice on streaming platforms that tracks that go from quite quiet mixes to much bigger mixes tend to hit home or be a bit more impactful than tracks that start loud and stay loud, that's why. It's because we've effectively got the opportunity for more dynamic range across the entire duration of a piece of music. Now, this has really interesting implications for EDM, which kind of has a reputation for loud for long. In other words, a kick drum might start right away and might last all the way through a track, and the only time it might drop out is a bar before it kicks back in with even more elements accompanying it. Whereas much more dynamically wide sort of mixed and mastered music tends somehow across those streaming platforms to feel a little bit more lively, because it benefits from the fact that those step-ups when they come can afford to be a little bit louder. So within this chapter, we've learned some important things. Firstly, how loudness is measured and what we can do in terms of thinking about that when it comes to streaming platforms. But we've also learned, and this is the really important part, that effectively you only have to really think about these things if you choose to. There is no barrier to entry for your music in terms of those streaming platforms. If you don't want to think about any of this, you just want to print your master and upload it to those platforms and have that music go out into the world, absolutely fine. The algorithms at the heart of those streaming platforms will do what they need to your music to make sure that it works within their playback systems. But if you want your music to sound as good as it possibly can, it's worth looking into this a little bit more and beginning to see how you can bring more dynamic range to your mixes, because the benefits of those things when it comes to those streaming platforms is really becoming very clear.